We're going to continue with the conversation, our post-dinner conversation with Federica Mogherini, until very recently the High Representative of the European Union. You're very welcome.
Thank you. I don't know if it's more difficult. You hear me?
Yes.
I don't know if it's more difficult to stand between the dinner and the dessert of the 5 years as High Representative. So forgive me for interrupting your dinner.
Well, I think we can eat and listen at the same time.
Yes.
So that's the trick. So
women for sure can.
Yes, multitasking is. So there are many things that, many parts of the world that we could discuss, but I think why don't we begin with the Prespes Agreement, because I think that is of great interest to everyone in this room. So perhaps first of all, can you give us your perspective on how solid this is and what the prospects are for good relations in future with North Macedonia and Greece?
Well, first of all, I think that the Prespa Agreement has been in itself a remarkable act of diplomacy, of courage, and the framework in which it has been built under the UN auspices and with a lot of diplomatic preparation and also through a lot of democratic consensus building on both sides and in the region has been quite remarkable. And I cannot say about the prospects, but what I can say is that I believe the agreement itself is extremely solid. I witnessed the signature of it, so maybe it's only natural for me to say so. But I also would like to say, someone in the previous panel mentioned the key role that Greece can have in the Balkans or in Southeast Europe. And I believe that that agreement builds even more solid basis for Greece to exercise the proper role that it's the role of Greece in this region, which is a role of being somehow the European Union point of reference in the Balkans, a role that can build a lot in terms of infrastructure, in terms of economic development, in terms of trade, in terms of culture, and also in terms of showing the way towards cooperative relations in the region.
So were you disappointed that France vetoed the accession process for North Macedonia at the last summit? Was that a disappointment for you? Was that envisaged, or is that a setback in this whole process?
I will take advantage of what Margaritis mentioned before of my freedom, reconquered freedom. A couple of months ago, I would have answered that I was extremely disappointed and worried for the lack of consensus on the decision to proceed with opening negotiations with both Albania and North Macedonia. Today, I can answer yes to your question. I was disappointed. I was even angry with that, because I have seen personally, and I think I've spent somehow 1/3 of my time and energy in the Balkans and with the Balkans in this last 5 years. And I've seen all the 6 partners of the European Union in this region moving forward. As Balkans move forward, which is 1 step forward, 3 back, 3 forward, 1 back, but all of them, and together, they've moved forward. And I think that we have to, as Europeans, understand that this is not enlargement. This is reunification of our continent. None of the 6 partners we have in the Balkans has external borders. They all have borders with EU member states. It's a hole in the heart of our union. And there's no way in which the European Union can reconquer real security, economic prosperity, even refugee crisis management, without the Balkans being on our side. And I think Greece can be the best sponsor, together with others, for this perspective. I've always said, to me, the European Union will never be completed until all of the Balkans will be inside.
So while you're in the mode of getting off your chest things that you couldn't say 2 months ago. Is there anything else?
I've always
is
said
there anything else you'd like to talk about that you couldn't have said 2 months ago that you would like to say?
I've always said, I've always said everything I wanted to say, and this is why sometimes I've been silent.
Okay. Well, is there anywhere where you anywhere else that you feel strongly about that you would like to speak out about?
No, I think we'll touch upon some issues
okay.
On which I will have the chance of saying things. But
okay.
Yes,
well,
that was for me when I was asked what was the biggest achievement I was proud of. I've always said, without hesitation, the European Union defence work that has been quite historical. And my biggest disappointment in the very last months has been the lack of political courage and consistency from the European Union member states' side, some more than others, to proceed consistently on the enlargement process.
Okay, well, could I go to what must be also another disappointment, because it was also at the time another of the big achievements, which was the Iran nuclear deal. So you were very heavily involved in this, and it was an example of Europe playing a major role. It must be upsetting to see this unravel in front of your eyes, no?
Yes and no. Because, first of all, I have to say I was heavily involved in the last phase of negotiations in 2015. Spent nights and days and weeks and months locked in, literally, to finalize the negotiations on it. But I also have to say it was a long journey. Started with Javier Solana and then continued with Catherine Ashton. It was a collective result. So we also have to pay tribute to others that have built these conditions. I have to say that until I left, I was quite satisfied. Everything is relative in this moment. But I was quite satisfied that the deal had survived the US decision to get out of the deal. Because I would have expected the deal to collapse much earlier. And it has not collapsed yet. So this is not yet something I would put in the box of disappointments, of big worries, definitely so, because things are getting much more complicated by the day. In particular in the last couple of weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. But what reassures me somehow, I'm an optimist, so I always try to see the bright side of things, is that still not only all the remaining signatories to the agreement, but also all the rest of the international community, with some exceptions that are not more than 3 or 4, stick to the intention to keep the agreement alive. There are increasing difficulties, but still I think most of the players realize that it would be extremely dangerous to get out of that agreement, which, by the way, is a UN Security Council resolution. So we're not talking about a treaty. We're talking about part of the multilateral system. And so I hope that one of your points about the fact that the international community might find out this year that it gave it for granted, nuclear non-proliferation maybe a little bit too early, I hope that prediction will be proven to be wrong this year, but I share your worries.
Okay. Libya, another
easy.
Yes.
Yes.
What do you think the ceasefire will hold, first of all?
Well, first of all, I have the impression that the ceasefire will need to be consolidated, because my impression is that still some military activities are going on the ground. And I think, first of all, the complexity of the Libyan crisis is in the fact that it has different layers. And even if you try to solve one of the layers and to address that successfully, you might have plenty of others that spoil the process. And most importantly, what we're seeing today is that the players on the ground, the military players on the ground, I think are still partially in the logic of gaining ground militarily, so that whenever and if negotiations politically will start, they will be in a stronger position to get what they want. I think Berlin was good, but I think the real step will have to be, first of all, a Security Council resolution, making it binding somehow, and most importantly, the sides in Libya to realize that the only way in which this crisis can be solved is if the Libyans themselves exercise their wisdom. I think, as an Italian, I can understand the Libyans quite well. I don't know if it's a compliment to whoever, but I think we have a similar kind of thinking. And I'm sure, 100%, I have no doubt about that, if it was only for the Libyans, and if they were locked in one room, can take 1 day, 3 days, 1 week, 3 months, they would find the way to share power and resources and keep the country united.
So it's the outside world, are you saying? It's the outside world that is...
It's a limited number of people with a lot of economic resources. But the problem is that you have the Libyan dynamic, then you have the neighbors, then you have the geopolitical game, including the game on oil and gas, and then you have the ideology. Because in my reading, the real unsolvable crisis in Libya is that this is the second part of a conflict that started in Egypt. And the question here is for the Muslim world, is it possible for political Islam to be part of the democratic life of a country or not? This is the real question that is being asked on the two sides. And it's a question that is not only relevant for Libya, but it's also relevant for the entire region, because you have Muslim Brotherhood kind of affiliates from Morocco to Jordan. So whatever answer you give to this question might solve or not solve the Libyan crisis, but might open or not open other crises in other countries that are also in our region. So I think, and by the way, it's a question in which us Europeans might not really have the right to enter, because it is indeed a reflection that the Muslim world has to have. But I have the impression that this is the real question that has been asked, and it's not by coincidence that on one side you find Turkey, and on the other side you find Egypt and the Emirates.
And you mentioned this question, you alluded to the question of oil and gas, which obviously is of great interest here. So what should be the proper European response or influence in this process? And you have, of course, a NATO dimension of it as well, with NATO members at odds over the issue.
I think Europeans have been long divided on this file. This is something I've not, for obvious reasons, necessarily said many times. But I think that Europeans today realize much more than before that they might be divided upon single issues, but they do share a common interest in Libya being in peace and stable and functioning. Because you might have seen one of the main elements of the conflict just in the last couple of days is the shutdown of all the oil facilities. This is definitely not an interest for any European. This combined with the fact that any territory in this region that is out of control of state authorities offers the space to jihadists to move. And Libya has become the main corridor for the people trafficking. I don't say anymore migration flows, because I really think it's a business of moving people around and making money out of it. So it's really, when we talk about Libya, we're talking about security issues, we're talking about oil and gas, and we're talking about trafficking of people. That creates a lot of business and money interests for many. Again, this is why I think the Berlin conference has been good, because it has tried once again to gather the different players, international players, on the UN agenda. You asked what should Europeans do? Support the UN agenda and try to help the Libyans unite, because this is the shared interest that the Libyans and the Europeans have. And I believe also the African Union has the same interest. So I think the intuition that the UN system had of creating a quartet for Libya, with the UN in the lead. The African Union, the European Union, and the League of Arab States was a good intuition. But divisions so far have impeded that process to bring fruits. But I think that would be the key. And finally, the key would be for the Libyans to say at a certain moment, you know what, we are sick and tired of this. We are very few people with a lot of resources. We can live wonderfully well without even any external support and live a normal life. Let us find our way. I'm not sure we're there yet, but I think that they could do it wonderfully well.
How do you, in your recent role until now, how do you deal with issues, and Libya is one issue, where the interests of member states of the European Union clash, and yet you have to try to represent a common European front? This must be one of the central challenges of that job. How can you work your way through that?
With a lot of diplomatic and communication training. Margherita's helped a lot in these last 5 years in the communication skills. No, but jokes apart. Many have asked me how is it possible to represent a union when a union on issues on which the union member states are divided. Maybe because I came to this position from the position of being a foreign minister of one member state. For me, it was always natural to try and shape the common ground, not in terms of what is the minimum common denominator, but what is it that the European Union can bring to the interest of member states that they cannot do alone. And again, the case of Libya is a paradigm of that. Some member states had different interests or different political views, but they were both suffering. Sorry, I said both. All suffering. All suffering. All.
Can we talk of Turkey?
Sorry?
Let's talk of Turkey a bit.
Yeah, he's asking the question. I follow him, but I'm happy to talk about everything. I'm happy to talk about that as well.
Let's finish with Libya first. We'll come on to Turkey.
With pleasure. But all European Union member states had and have a common interest in trying to stabilize Libya, having Libya as a secure and governed country. So identifying the national interest that required the European Union action to be fulfilled was the key. Then sometimes you have more space, some other times you have a little bit less space. But this is part of life. This happens also in national politics. Sometimes you are a minister of a coalition government and you have exactly the same problem.
So let's talk of Turkey, since that's obviously a great interest in the room. How do you see the issue of competing claims, particularly claims where there are big minerals prizes at stake, resolving themselves in this region?
Listen, I've lived in this last few years in particular. I think I've been one of those that has tried the most to build channels for dialogue with Turkey, in particular on Syria, on other issues, on Libya as well. But I think I've also been the toughest and most vocal when it comes to Cyprus. Because I think that you can't play with territorial issues. And if you are a union to be taken seriously, you have to defend your member states' territorial sovereignty. This is a must. And let me add that this doesn't contradict the need to keep or build, sometimes build more than keep, an open channel of dialogue with Turkey. On the contrary. One lesson I've learned in these 5 years is that you can be very tough, but you can still be very open. And the two things are not in contradiction one to each other. On the contrary, the toughest you are on the issues on which you really have to be clear, the more you can afford yourself to be open and offer a dialogue on other issues. Because Two things are not to be confounded. And on the other side, the more you're credible in offering a dialogue, for instance, on solving the Cyprus issue. I was in Crans-Montana. I was with Guterres there, and with, well, at the time, the Greek representation and also the rest. And I still think that the Cyprus issue can be solved, could be solved. And it would be extremely beneficial, first of all, for the European Union and for Cyprus. And for Turkey as well.
Just to be clear, when you talk about the Cyprus issue, you mean the solution for the future of the island and the accession of all of Cyprus?
Absolutely. Yeah. But being clear on the fact that we need to have, as a European Union, a good, as good as possible relation, or at least dialogue, with a difficult neighbor, which is also a country that is negotiating somehow, formally, its accession to the European Union. And still, in any case, a neighbor, because you don't change geography. You can't choose your neighbors. This is the harsh reality of life. There are three things you can't change in life. You can't change history. You can change how your narrative of history, but you can't change the past. You can't change geography. And you can't change your parents, but this is a private issue. I'm very happy with mine. But the point is this. We would have, as Europeans, all the interest in solving the Cyprus issue, having the best possible neighborly relations with Turkey, and we have a duty, an absolute duty, to defend the territorial sovereignty, not only the territorial sovereignty, of our member states. The three things can go together, must go together, in my view.
Let's take a couple of questions. We haven't got a lot of time, but let's take a couple of questions from the room, if there are. Okay. Two back here.
I work in the gas industry. I work in the gas industry for a Greek company called Enlargement.
Can you say your name? Sorry, so that we...
My name is Vincent Roboulsals. I develop a gas field in offshore Israel. It's at least 8 years ahead of the Aphrodite development in Cyprus that was discovered in 2007. And it's obvious to me that we need very strong European policy makers to support any kind of infrastructure project such as EastMed. What are you doing? I'm waiting for it. And a lot of private sector people are waiting for it. DEPA, Edison, Energian, INGL.
Okay, you've asked your question. You've asked your question. Would you like to?
Yeah, I'm out of office now, but I'm happy to go back. Jokes apart, there has been a lot of work in this respect, and I hope there can be more. The point is this. Sorry, you wanted to take another question together, or can I answer?
You can answer. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll be quick. The point is this. There's a certain amount of things you can do from Brussels. There's a certain amount, first of all, there's a certain amount of things you can do from the infrastructural point of view. There's a certain amount of things that you can do in a certain geopolitical context. My particular job was more on the geopolitics of it than the infrastructure part of it, but it's a sort of precondition. I personally believe, and I've always worked in that direction as long as I was in office, I've always been convinced that the same principle that was at the basis of the creation of the European Union, which was making business together is much more convenient than being at war with one another, because we all started in the European Union with something very, very basic and not so poetic, like steel and coal. So it was common interest. It was not ideals and values. It was also ideals and values, but it was basically the fact that at a certain moment, after thousands of years, we said, listen, wait a moment, we've been killing each other for thousands of years, and literally thousands of years. Can't we do business together and try to live better? I think the same principles apply perfectly well to the Eastern Mediterranean. Perfectly well. And I think it's only a matter of time and political wisdom to have leaders in the region. We can't do that from Brussels. Leaders in the Eastern Mediterranean region that realize that the common economic interest is much, much bigger than the conflicts of the past.
Okay, question at the front here. Let's take this one. If you just wait for a microphone, it's coming here, then everybody can hear. Just at the...
Thank you. As a historian, because you mentioned historical facts about the European Union, I think you're not really saying the facts, because the cooperation worked as the aggressor could not attack everyone else anymore. And this is not happening in the case of Turkey, and as a Cypriot, I feel very strongly about the Turkish army, because every day I open my window, I see 40,000 troops across the Green Line. So there can be no cooperation or mutual understanding if the weapons are there and the aggressor is there. So the historical example you're using is wrong. And of course, let's not forget that the Americans chaperoned the whole thing and financed the whole thing with the Marshall Plan. So the realities were very, very different. And I think we take great offense as Cypriots when you're suggesting the Franco-German cooperation and the romantic insinuations behind this story of the EU being created in this, in this very nice way, because the realities were different. There was an aggressor, the aggressor was defeated, could no longer harm everyone else, and cooperation happened in that way. Thank you.
Was there a question, or was that?
No, it was a comment, but it was something I felt very strongly about.
That's okay. Do we have a question? Another question. Last question, and then we'll. Yeah, at the back there.
Good evening. My name is Marios Andrikopoulos. I'm a lawyer. Ms. Mogherini, you seem to know very well the question of Libya. If you were in office today, how would you comment the pact between Turkey and the Sarad's government in Libya? And do you think that this pact violates the territorial rights of Greece? Since you mentioned that the European Union should by default protect the territorial rights. And would you think that this pact poses a threat to the sovereign rights of Greece, but to the stability of the region as well? Thank you.
I imagine you refer to the memorandum of understanding on the territorial, on the maritime.
Exactly. Between Turkey and the Sarad's government.
On the maritime,
the exclusive economic zone.
Exclusive economic zone. If I were in office, but even as I am not in office, in this case, things wouldn't change. I would refer 100% to two things. One is the conclusions of the European Council in December, if I'm not wrong, that speak very clear words about this, commenting it clearly as a violation, non-responding to international law and an attempt to violate the rights of member states of the European Union. And also, I would refer to the very clear words that the President of the European Council used in that respect. I think the European Union has reacted clearly to that. And if you allow me, I will comment on the comment, because this links. Cooperation with someone that is aggressive in that moment, and quite since a long time, in the position of violating international law, as it is the case in Cyprus. What I said before, I think it's true. That is my opinion. That you can find ways of being extremely clear and tough, with no ambiguity at all, and even with some consequences. I've chaired myself. I probably was the last or the almost last Foreign Affairs Council when we decided to adopt a framework for sanctions on Turkey. That took us some 7-8 hours to have that discussion and consensus on that. I am convinced that you have to be 100% clear and tough whenever there is a violation of international law or the rights of member states. But I also think that closing up channels of communication, including with those that you are criticizing or even targeting with sanctions at a certain moment, is vital to reverse the situation, because you don't want to live in a situation of aggression or conflict for your life.
Sorry,
so
you mean it's vital to open up channels, not to close up channels.
Yes, yeah. not to close. Sorry. But it's Friday night at the end of the day. But I think that you can do both things. And I think that actually it works better to do the two things at the same time. To be tough as you can on the things that you see must receive a reaction that is very clear, no ambiguity, but also to say, okay, we both can have an interest in changing the status quo. How can we get there? Because I believe it's also in the interest, well, first of all, it's in the interest of the European Union. It's in the interest of Greece. It's in the interest of Cyprus. I believe it's also in the interest of Turkey at the end of the day to build a more cooperative relation in the region. Whenever there is aggression or conflict, I don't believe in the I win, you lose. I think that whenever there is a situation like this, at the end of the day, everybody loses. So I think that being tough, being clear, as the European Council has been on this memorandum of understanding between Turkey and Libya, or as we have been on the Cyprus issue, doesn't prevent you and actually gives you even more responsibility to try and imagine how can the situation develop in a more positive way in the future? Because you cannot count on the other one to do that work. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an aggressor. You have to take somehow the burden, the responsibility, rationally and responsibly, first of all on your side, to try and see if there are common grounds on which you can build some win-win situation. Again, it's not the wind that is blowing today. The description of the state of the world today and in 2020 you gave is perfectly accurate and extremely worrying. But I think that the European Union is one of the few forces in the world that still refers to rationality and a cooperative approach. And I think we cannot waste that little treasure we have, not only for ourselves but also for the rest of the world.
So we're almost out of time, but I don't want to end without asking you for your predictions for 2020. You can have one or you could have several.
I will not say anything about the US elections. So what?
What about this region? Because there was a concern earlier on that, you know, broadly the economy seemed to be on a good trajectory, but there was a geopolitical worry about the environment. Do you share that?
One of your points was about the Gulf welcoming the world in 2020. This would probably be the point, together and linked with the nuclear non-proliferation issue, on which I would focus the most for 2020. And I think that what I said before about the need to try and find ground for win-win solutions or cooperative approaches, in particular in economic terms and security terms, would be extremely valuable for the Gulf. You mentioned the G20 presidency in Saudi Arabia. You mentioned the Expo. By the way, I was a minister when we prepared the Expo in Milan, and okay. I survived.
Milan, right?
It was very good.
It was very
good. It was not so good for my health, but it was very good. One of the most difficult things to organize. But you mentioned the Expo in the Emirates. If I'm not wrong, there's the World Cup in Qatar. The region would only benefit from good security, good and sound security environment, and a more cooperative one. Not to mention countries like Iraq that would simply survive or not, probably, were the region going to be meeting more tensions or not. So predictions, I cannot, and I've never given predictions, but I would say that this is going to be, I think, the key element for this year. The elections in the United States and in Israel. And electoral years are normally dangerous ones when it comes to the Middle East, because it's an issue for electoral campaigns in many places. And I think that, yes, the main issue here will be the combination of these two elections, together with the developments around the Gulf and the non-proliferation agenda.
Thank you very much. Can you join me, please, in thanking Federica Mogherini?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.